So we are, we live in grace. We live in grace. And for today's message, I'd like you all to turn to Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 9. 2 Samuel chapter 9. It's 13 verses. I'm just going to read them out. 2 Samuel chapter 9. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" There was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. So they called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there no longer anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show goodness and the graciousness of God?" Ziba replied to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan whose feet are crippled." So the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba replied to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodebar." And King David sent word and had him brought from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodebar. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell down and lay himself down. David said, "Mephibosheth," and he answered, "Here is your servant." And David said to him, "Do not be afraid, for I will certainly show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall always eat at my table." Again, Mephibosheth lay himself face down and said, "What is your servant that you would be concerned for a dead dog like me?" And the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and he said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and to his family. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in produce so that your master's grandson may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Amen. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do according to everything my lord commands." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet. Now, most of us are familiar with this section. We know about David and how Saul was hunting him and trying to kill him, but Jonathan loved David, right? And Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son. Now, both Saul and Jonathan are dead now, and David wants to show his love to Mephibosheth for Jonathan's sake. He wants to give everything to Mephibosheth for Jonathan's sake. That's why he wants to do it, because he loved him so much. And that's the section that we read. And he also says that I'm going to give Saul, Saul was trying to kill him all his life, right? But he says, your grandfather's property, I'm going to give it all back to him. And but Mephibosheth shall eat at my table. I'm going to give this all back to him, but he shall eat at my table. He's going to be my guest. He's going to eat at the king's house, right? Amen. So this is how much he wants to show his love, or he shows his love. Amen. So now the title of today's message is The Case of the Lame Prince. He was lame in both feet. He was lame in both feet, right? And so I'm going to start off with a story about Fiorello LaGuardia. Fiorello LaGuardia was the mayor of New York City during the days of the Great Depression and the Second World War. So it was a very difficult time. He was the mayor of New York City. I mean, I'm just trying to, because God's grace is something that we cannot understand. Undeserved. We are totally undeserving of God's grace. So this is just an example of grace. Just an example of grace. So Fiorello LaGuardia was the mayor of New York City during the days of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And he was just 5'2", and he always wore a flower in his lapel. Just 5'2", and he always wears a flower. As a result, New Yorkers would affectionately call him the little flower, because he was a short man, right? They would affectionately call him the little flower, the little flower. And he was a colorful character, every time the fire engines, there's a bomb strike or something, or a fire breaks out, he also jumps onto the fire engine and he goes to the place where the fire is being fought, and he would join the police when they raided bootleggers. Bootleggers are, kalachara, illegal liquor, places where they make illegal liquor. So he would go with them, the police, when they raided those places, and he would sometimes take all the children in the orphanage to see a baseball game, because baseball is like cricket in India, right? So they just love watching baseball. And he would take all the children in the orphanage to see baseball games, and sometimes he would even get on the local radio station and read out children's stories for the children's entertainment. He would get on the local radio station, right? So it was this kind of a colorful character. And one bitterly cold night in January of 1935, that's almost 90 years ago, 91 years ago, he decided, he ended up at the night court, because you have day courts and night courts, because crimes are being committed all the time, right? And so this is a night court that serves the poorest ward of the city. And so he dismissed the judge, and he said, I'll be the judge today. Just lets the judge have the night off, and he sits in the judge's place. And within a few minutes, a tattered old woman was brought before him. An old woman in tattered clothes. She was brought before him, and she was accused by a shopkeeper of stealing a loaf of bread from his shop. This was the accusation. And she comes there and she tells LaGuardia, she says, my daughter's husband has deserted her. She is sick and her 2 grandchildren are starving. This is the situation. My sister's husband has deserted her. My daughter's husband has deserted her. She is sick and her 2 children are starving. That is why I stole that loaf from there. But then the shopkeeper, this is obviously anybody can see that she shouldn't be punished, right? But the shopkeeper says, he says, Your Honor, this is a very bad neighborhood. So if you let her go, that means more people are going to come and steal from my shop. That's what's going to happen. So you have to punish her. You have to punish her. That's what he tells him. Because it's a bad neighborhood. We have to set the right example. We have to set the right example. So LaGuardia, he listens to us and he signs, and he turns to this woman and he says, I've got to punish you. Because the law doesn't make any exceptions, The law doesn't make any exceptions. I have to punish you. And so he says, I'll have to fine you $10. $10. So according to what they do is either you pay the $10 fine or you spend 10 days in jail. This is what it is. Either you pay $10 or you got to spend 10 days in jail. But even as he was making the sentence, he put his hand into his own pocket. Even as he was delivering the sentence, he put his hand into his own pocket and he took out 10 pounds. He took out 10 pounds and he said, and I am giving you this money. And he puts this 10 out. He wears this sombrero. Sombrero is a hat, a cowboy hat. So he takes this hat off and he says, he puts this money into that hat. And then he says, furthermore, I am going to fine every single person in this court 50 cents. So there are a lot of criminals, a lot of lawyers. There's the shopkeeper who has made the complaint against her. Lawyers, all those people. So I'm going to fine every person in this court 50 cents. Because, you know the reason why? Because you're living in a town where a person has to steal bread so that her grandchildren have to eat. I'm fining you 50 cents because you are living in a town where a woman has to steal a loaf of bread to feed her hungry grandchildren. That shouldn't be like that. So I am fining everybody 50 cents. And he sends his sombrero, he sends his hat around, and everybody puts 50 cents into it, including the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper's face is all red because he has come here to punish her, and now he has to give 50 cents, right? And in the end, that grandmother got $47.50. 50 cents. This is $47.50. So every single person, including all the criminals, all the lawyers, all the attendants, everybody put in 50 cents and $47.50. And that woman was given to this. This is just a good example of grace, you know, a good example of grace. Because God's grace is something that we cannot understand. Amen. Undeserved. We are totally undeserved. You know, after they did this, all the people in the court stood up and they gave the judge a standing ovation. They gave the judge a standing ovation. Everybody, including the shopkeeper who came with the company, they gave the judge a standing ovation. So that's a good example of grace. This is how God treats us. This is how God treats us. So this is the very essence of God's saving grace, the very essence of God's grace. So God recognizes our wretched condition, He pays our debt, and He gives us more than we deserve. That's how God treats us. And John Newton, he got it right when he called it amazing grace. You know, we all know that song, right? Amazing grace. Because that's what that grace is. That grace is amazing. It's amazing grace. And this is the passage that we just read in the Bible is one of the clearest portraits of God's grace. The grace that David showed Mephibosheth. Because Mephibosheth's grandfather was trying to kill him. But Jonathan loved him. And it was for Jonathan. It was for Jonathan that David was doing all this. So that's why we're going to talk about the case of the lame prince today, right? Because Mephibosheth is actually the grandson of a king. He is a prince, but he's a prince who is lame. Okay, now the reason for this grace, as we said before, he wants to show this grace to Mephibosheth for Jonathan's sake. He's doing it for Jonathan's sake. And grace is undeserved. Grace is completely undeserved. And God is one person, grace is one person accepting another person unconditionally, regardless of the unworthiness of the person being accepted. That's what God's grace is. You know, unconditional acceptance regardless of our unworthiness. Even as believers we fall, but we ask for His forgiveness and He washes us clean. Even as believers we fall, but our unworthiness. So regardless of our unworthiness, God accepts us. And that's what David is doing to a member of Saul's family, right? Because of Jonathan. Because of Jonathan. Now, especially in the olden days, we know how people treated their enemies. Because enemies, not just enemies, once a king ascends to power, so he gets the seat. Very often he even kills off his own brothers because they are next in line, and he wants his own children to become the next kings, right? So even his own brothers are not safe because he wants to protect the throne for his own children. So killing was something that happened. So, and we know about Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian leader, who, after he came to power, what did he do? His first official act was to mutilate, execute, and feed the bodies of his rivals to the dogs. He mutilated them, and then he executed them, and then he cut them into small pieces, and he threw them to the dogs. This is how enemies are treated, and this is how all people are treated, by people in power. But God does not do that. God does not do that. So when you look at it one day, what Ashurbanipal did would be justice. He was doing that to protect his own children. He was doing that so that his own children could become the next king. That's why he did that. But God does not give us justice. God gives us grace. God gives us grace. That is the God who we worship. Because, we don't want to face the justice of God. Because the justice of God, we talk about the wrath of God. Where does the wrath of God come from? It comes from the justice of God. The wrath of God comes from the justice of God. And we don't want to face that. We can only live with the grace of God. Grace of God. All right. And so when you look at grace, this grace, why is God's grace extended to us like this? Because of Jesus Christ. Amen. Because of Jesus Christ. God's grace is extended to us because of Jesus Christ. Just as David's grace to Mephibosheth was extended because of Jonathan. So grace is extended because of someone else. Amen. It's not because we deserve anything. It's not because we deserve it. Because of someone else. This is the nature of grace. It is extended because of someone. And God extended his grace to the descendants of Adam, right? To the sons of Adam, the daughters of Adam. Because Jesus paid the price. Because Jesus paid the price. So God's grace is also extended to us because of another. The love of his son. His grace is extended to us because of what Jesus did on the cross. That's why it's called amazing grace. That's why it's called amazing grace. And the reach of this grace. What is the reach of this grace? The grace of God is extended to anyone, to all who would come, right? And not to some type of people, to all, to anyone who will come, anyone who will accept Christ. Just as David's love was extended to anyone of the family of Saul, anyone of the family of Saul, because of Jonathan. Anyone of the family, because of Jonathan's sake. So the house of Saul was the house of the man who wanted to kill him, right? But no, because of Jonathan, he extends his love. And anyone who was a member of Saul's family. And God's grace knows no boundaries. No boundaries. Anyone, all who want to, can come. And as sinners, our condition is we are dead, we are deceived, we are depraved, and we are doomed. This is our state as sinners, as human beings. We are dead, deceived, depraved, and doomed. And God extends his grace to us. God extends his grace to us. Now, where was Mephibosheth when David found him? He was in Manchir. He was in the house of Manchir, in a place called Lodabar. So Manchir means sold, and Lodabar means no pasture. So Manchir means sold, And Lodabar means no pasture. Pasture is where you feed your animals, right? No pasture. So he was in a place of death. And he was destined to spend his life there without fruit, without benefit, without growth. And David extends his love for him there. So he was the son of royalty, crippled, unable to seek or get to the king, the son of royalty. But he was crippled. Just as us, we were made in the image of God, right? We were made in the, but we were crippled. We were crippled by sin.
Yes.
Crippled by sin. We could not reach God. We could not reach God. And he comes out to us. He comes out to us. So he was unable to seek or get to the king. He was separated, in hiding, and afraid. Even his name means shameful. Mephibosheth. Even the very name means shameful. Means shameful. So he was in a hopeless condition, and he was helpless to do anything about it. Hopeless in a helpless. He was hopeless in a helpless condition. He couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't do anything about it. And that is so much what we were. That is so much what we were when God sent his son to die for us. And he's in a place where he cannot help himself. He cannot help himself. He cannot even walk. He cannot help himself. He cannot even help himself. And as we read in Ephesians 2:12, that at the time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. That was our state. That was the state of Mephibosheth. So the lost sinner is a slave to his passions. He's a slave to the devil. He's in a place of absolute slavery. He's a place where there is no pasture and no hope. That's where we all were. And so there's no one to hear him when he prays. There's no one to help him. There's no one that he can turn to. He has no help. He has no help at all. And but God. So it's in that situation that God extends his hand, right? So the way David extended his hand to help Mephibosheth, God extended his hand to Jesus Christ to help us. God's salvation was available to whoever will come through Jesus. So there are no limits on who can come, and grace is extended to all. Anyone who is a descendant of Adam can avail of this grace that God extends. All right. So no one deserves grace and salvation, but anyone can have it. No one deserves it, but anyone can have it. It is available to all of us, but none of us deserve it. None of us deserve it. That's what makes grace so amazing. Makes it so amazing. So grace doesn't care about our background, our surroundings, our abilities, our appearance, our future potential. Grace doesn't care about anything. Grace doesn't care about anything. The response of grace is always to ask, where is he? That's the response of grace. That's what God does, That's what David did. When he heard that there's someone left over from the house of Saul, David says, where is he? Because he is going there. He doesn't. It's not that he's going. That person has to come by himself. He is going there. That's what God did. He came here. He sent his son to die for us on that cross. Just as David, when he heard this, he sent his servants to fetch him. To fetch him. He sent his servants to fetch him, to bring him. That's what David did. So grace says, I'm not concerned about his condition. I want him just as he is.
Amen.
He can't walk,
Yes.
No problem. I want him just as he is. That's how God took us, just as we are. Just as we are. So it is with the amazing grace of God. He doesn't look upon us and concern himself about our crippled spiritual condition, right? We are spiritual cripples. We're not, some of us might not be physical cripples, but we are spiritual. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about that. And he just comes and he fetches us. So we are all fetched by grace. Just as David sent his servants to fetch Mephibosheth, Jesus Christ, God through Jesus Christ fetched us. He came to where we were and he took us. He took us from where we were and he placed us where he wants us to be, right? He took us from where we were. That's what grace is. That's what grace is. That's why we call it amazing grace. Amazing grace. So Mephibosheth was the last survivor of the family of Saul. And was it not for the grace of David, a grace David demonstrated there, the entire family of Saul would have come to an end, right? The entire family would have come to an end. But David saved him. David saved him. And that's how we are saved. That's how we are saved. And okay, that's how this grace is extended. The grace is extended. And now we see how this grace is embraced. Because there's something that, as human beings, that we have to do. When this grace is extended, we have to embrace it. We have to embrace it. So just let's place ourselves in the feet of Mephibosheth. You know, Mephibosheth knows that his grandfather was trying to kill David, and everyone has warning, be careful about David, hide from David. You got to be, you don't need to worry about anyone else, but you need to worry about David, because if David is looking for you, that means you're in big trouble. Right? That's what everybody would have told him. And yet, in the middle of all that, he is willing to listen. He's willing to accept him. He's willing to take him in. Because we are in a helpless position and our life is helpless. He's a cripple, and he has been a cripple since he was 5 years old. And now we know that, 2 Samuel 4:4, we learn how he was crippled. When he was 5, his father was killed in battle. And when that horrible news came, Mephibosheth's nurse tried to flee with the child, and she dropped him, and his legs were permanently damaged. That's how he became a cripple. Because the nurse was trying to escape with him, but she dropped him in a hurry, and that's how he became a. So look at him. He did not have access to the wealth of his family, the wealth of his father and his grandfather. He'd been warned that David definitely would want to kill him. He'd been warned about all those things. And when he hears the sound of horse hooves coming, you can imagine what he would have thought. But and they're coming for him. They're coming for him. They're coming from the king's palace. But they take him and they take him into the king's presence. And he embraces it. He embraces it. He's grateful. He falls at David's feet. He falls at David's feet. So he embraces it with a humble heart. And he knew that he deserved nothing but judgment from David. He knew that. But he sees this grace, this love of David. He's the love of David. And he embraces it with a humble heart and with a happy heart. So instead of judgment, he experiences the king's tenderness. Because when David looks at Mephibosheth, he is not seeing what Saul tried to do to him. He is seeing what Jonathan did for him. He's not seeing what Saul tried to do for him. He is seeing what Jonathan did. That's why he lavishes all this love on him. And he hears David calling him by name. David calls him by name. And David speaks peace to him. Speaks peace and love to him. That's what David says to him. He hears the king's promise of restoring all the wealth and glory that once belonged to the family of Saul. That's what David says. Everything that belonged to your grandfather, I'm giving it all back to you. And the icing of the cake. The icing of the cake is what David says, you are going to eat at my own table. At my own table.
Amen.
You're not going to just have this wealth and go back to your own place. No, you're going to eat at my own table, amongst my own sons, amongst my own children, because you are my son, and you're going to eat at my table. And so it's a very happy heart. He's full of dread. He's full of dread when the soldiers come to his home. But when he comes here, he's so happy. He's so relieved. He's overcome with happiness. And he acknowledges that he is undeserving. That's why he says, I am nothing. I'm like a dog, right? And yet you treat me like this. You treat me like this. And this is a good picture of the lost sinner who encounters the grace of God, the lost sinner. And so the call of God, when we hear the call of God, we all heeded the call of God. We heeded the call of God. And that's what we need to do. That's what all believers need to do. All unbelievers need to do. Because, and when you experience the saving grace of God, you understand how overwhelming it truly is.
Amen.
The saving grace of God, the love of God is so overwhelming. So overwhelming. And that's what he understands. Okay, and so all of us were lost sinners once, and we were fetched into the presence of God. And we had a lot of fear and anger and doubts and all that. But we realized what a loving God he is. God, as we were singing that song, God is loving. God loves us. And we are loved by him. That's all we need to know, right? That we are loved by him. We're that important to him. So each of us were fetched like this into the presence of God. Into the presence of God. And we see how grace is expanded. So we see how grace is extended, how grace is embraced, and how grace is expanded. Because it's only once you trust that grace and come into its presence that you realize, you see the magnitude and the magnificence of the plans that God has for you. It's only then that you see. You stand on the outside, you cannot see anything that God is going to do for you. All you have is the fear and the doubt and the anger. But once you come in and trust in him, then you see how that grace is extended. So grace provided a future for this man. In Lodabar, Mephibosheth had nothing. He was poor. He was an outcast. He was a fugitive. He had no hope and no prospects for his future. But when he met grace, everything changed. All his present needs were met and his future was secured. It's not just that his present needs were met, his future was secured. Grace gave Mephibosheth something that he never had in Lodabar. Grace gave him a future. Grace gave him the plenty of the king. Grace gave him the peace of the king. So this is what grace gives him: the plenty of the king and the peace of the king. Until that moment, he was living in dread of these horsemen from David coming. Living in dread of that, but now he has the plenty of the king and the peace of the king. And Mephibosheth is not expected to come to David's table on certain days, every day. He was to eat at the king's table every day. Not on certain days, not once in a while, every day. Because he was made part of the king's family. That's what it means. He was made part of the king's family. Just as we are now part of God's family. Part of God's family. So we lost everything through Adam and we gained everything through Christ. We were outcasts and fugitives running for our lives from a holy God who possessed the right and the power to send us to a lost eternity. That's where we were. But God stepped in. God changed history. He sent his son to die for us, to pay the price for our sin. That's how he said it. So we had no future, but we are promised security. We had no home of our own, but we are promised a home in heaven. We had no hope, but we are promised that all our needs will be met. We had no one, but we are promised His presence all the way to heaven. So I used to be a nobody, headed for hell, headed nowhere but hell. Yeah, I used to be a nobody, headed nowhere but hell. But now, by grace, I'm a somebody headed to heaven. We used to be nobodies headed to hell, and now we are somebody and we're headed to heaven. That's why it's called amazing grace. Amazing grace. So grace restores everything that we lost. And God provides us with a family. As Mephibosheth becomes part of David's family. He doesn't sit on the outside, or he doesn't sit in his own home. He eats at the king's table. He was the recipient of grace. And so in Adam, we were doomed to die. In Jesus, we are destined for life. Destined for life. So God took us from Lodabar and brought us into the family of God. May we never forget that we have what we have, and that we are what we are simply by the good grace of God. So whatever we have and whatever we are is by the grace of God. That's why it's called amazing. And grace provides fulfillment. Fulfillment in his heart. He was satisfied. Because until now, he was like a fugitive. He didn't know when the king was going to come and kill him. That's what he thought. So wrong. And it provides fulfillment. So he was a nobody in a house who belonged. He was a nobody in a house full of. Okay, that's okay. So now we're looking at David's house. So there was Absalom, perfect and handsome. The handsomeness of Absalom is something that we read about, right? It even went to his head finally. So perfect and handsome. There were David's other sons. There were David's beautiful wife and daughters. There was Job, the general, proud and strong. There were princes and princesses, soldiers and statesmen, men of wealth, men of decree, men of power. All these took their place at the table of King David. All these people took their place at the table of King David. And as the family gathers, you hear the sound of a crippled man walking. Because a crippled man has to use crutches to walk. He can't walk freely, right? So you can, after all these men are seated, hear the sound of this crippled man walking up to this table. His feet are dragging, but he comes and he sits at the same table. And when the tablecloth falls across his legs, he looks just like everybody else. What is his crippleness is covered with the tablecloth. Just as Jesus covers everything that we have. All the weaknesses, all the failures that we have are covered. Just as the tablecloth covered his legs. And Mephibosheth looked just like everybody else. There was no difference between Mephibosheth and all the other people. Because that is the power of grace. That is what grace has done for each one of us. Each one of us can now sit at the table. We're part of God's family because of that. That is the power of grace. That's the power of grace. So when grace fetched you, what did grace do? It elevated us to a new position. All of us have been elevated to this position. Very often when I'm giving these messages, what the thought that comes to me, or maybe I should say what the devil keeps telling me is, you don't have the right to give these messages. Look at your life. Look at the way you live. But because of grace. So all that is hidden under the tablecloth. It is covered by the tablecloth. Even Jesus Christ is being pictured as a dress, right? When we wear Jesus Christ, God does not see all the filth on the inside. He only sees what Jesus Christ did for us. So we're elevated to a new position. That's why. So even with our failures, he was still a cripple. He was still a cripple, but he was sitting at the king's table. He was equal to all others because that's what grace does. It covers us. It covers us. And so all of us, we are, we're saved, but we still sin, we fall, right? So we are a bunch of spiritual cripples, but we are eating at the king's table. We're eating at the king's table. That's what Jesus covers us. Jesus covers us. So even though I fail him and often prove my crippled condition by stumbling and falling, I am still his child and I am always welcome at his table. I might be, I might still stumble and fall, but I am welcome at his table. And we are all welcome at his table. That is what grace is. So thank God for grace, because grace is soul-saving and life-changing grace. That's the grace that God has offered us. And all of us have been fetched, just as Mephibosheth was fetched by the servants of David. We have been fetched by God to come into his home, to come into his presence, to eat at his table. So let's remember that. Let us remember that. So even when we stumble and fall, God washes us and places us back at his table again, because he's a cleansing God. He's a washing God. And let us always remember that none of us none of us are in God's family because we deserve it. It is because of his grace. And that grace is amazing